Hi, I'm Rachel, and this is my 2024 BookTube Prize Octofinals wrap-up video. I feel like I'm very late with this video. Robert made the quarterfinals announcement video over a week ago now, which you've probably watched if you're watching this one, but I'll link to that video down below. But anyway, the BookTube Prize was started by Robert Sheard back in 2019. The point is for the online literary community to have space to come together and judge the best in literary fiction and nonfiction published in the US in English the year before. And we start with the Octofinals list. It's our longest long list where both literary fiction and nonfiction have 48 books each in their divisions, and then every 2 months individual judges rank the books, and then there's an aggregate judging, and the list is halved, and we move forward until we get to October and we can announce the winners and runners-up. So, for the Octofinals this year, as an official judge, I judged nonfiction Group B. And now I can finally talk about what I thought about all of these books. And I liked all of the books in my round, really. It was a really compelling couple of reading months. But alas, ultimately we have to rank them for this prize to work. And of the 3 books I decided should move on to the quarterfinals, 2 of them made the official list. So I feel pretty good about that. I'll have more information to share with regards to stats, like throughout the prize running. I track how well the books I personally voted to make into the long list are doing throughout the prize, but I will keep that whole thing for my quarterfinals video, which should hopefully be coming out very soon. But before I get to that, I want to wrap up the Octofinals. So, without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and give some brief thoughts about the books, starting with the one I ranked number 6, which is the lowest on my ballot, to the one I ranked as number 1. So, in 6th place, I put A Fever in the Heartland, The Ku Klux Klan's Plot to Take Over America, and the Woman Who Stopped Them, by Timothy Egan. So this book actually advanced to the quarterfinals, meaning a bunch of the judges in my pool ranked it much higher than I did. But anyway, this is the recounting of D.C. Stevenson, who about 100 years ago sort of catapulted himself to become a grand dragon of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s Midwest. And he's kind of a guy who came from nothing, and he lied a lot about his credentials, but he played into, you know, race biases and sort of political realities of the time to take the Ku Klux Klan far in the 1920s, which was a pretty big resurgence of the hate group, which was targeting African Americans and also immigrants, Catholics, Jews, you know, all the undesirables. And he had a pretty stunning fall from grace when he was brought to trial for assaulting and ultimately leading to the death of a young woman named Madge Oberholzer. And therein lies some of my problems with this book. I mean, the main problem I had with this book is not that it's not compelling. It obviously is. But I felt like things didn't come together fully in this book. Part of the problem, I think, is the subtitle, which might not actually be the author's fault, but I feel like it led to false promises about what to expect from this book, that it linked the fall of the Ku Klux Klan too closely to Madge and her death, or her life, in fact, and that it came off to me that she would be some sort of freedom fighter and someone who was actively looking to take the Klan down, and that's not the truth about her very tragic death. And it was a last-ditch attempt, as she was dying horribly of having poisoned herself, that she gives testimony against him, which is very explicitly about his crimes against her. And the fall of the Ku Klux Klan is technically separate from that. And so much of, the part of the book about the trial is much more specifically about how the trial went down. Although even there, I felt like Ega didn't prove exactly why the jury ultimately convicted Stevenson, which was a huge deal because he was a huge man in town. Like, he considered himself beyond the law, above the law, and so did everyone else around him. And that was the big buildup of the beginning of the story. So I feel like, first of all, he didn't prove exactly what happened and why, but also it really wasn't directly related to the fall of the Klan. I feel the Klan had to do was sort of separate itself from Stevenson, and it was going strong. It continued to go strong. So ultimately, I feel like the book failed to make its arguments about the fall of the Klan and why it happened, or even why Stevenson was convicted, although it was certainly thrilling and it felt like, huge amounts of great justification that someone so vile could go down and that such a vile organization could go down. But yeah, this is really just a criticism of how the book was put together. In fifth place, I put The Best Minds, a story of friendship, madness, and the tragedy of good intentions by Jonathan Rosen. So this is kind of sort of a memoir, kind of sort of biography, kind of sort of social history. I think it skirted a bunch of lines, which for me might be part of the reason why I ultimately ranked it so low, because it could meander around between those genres quite a bit. But the most compelling part of this story to me is Jonathan Rosen telling the story, the tragic story of the downfall of his friend Michael Lauder. So Jonathan and Michael grew up together in the 1970s in a New York suburb, and they both were kind of golden boys, as it were. So the beginning of the story is in large part about their friendship together. They, lose a little bit of touch when they go off to college. They're not, as close or as involved in each other's lives. And then it is while Michael is working for this company on his 10-year plan that he experiences his first psychotic break, or that the pieces are coming together that will ultimately coalesce into his diagnosis of schizophrenia. And he is ultimately hospitalized after he has a psychotic break where he is convinced that his parents are Nazi spies, and that he is stalking the house to kill these Nazi spies. So he is sort of coerced into committing himself to hospital at that point, but it's a relatively short stay, under a year. And then it comes down to, what will be the best option for him to, come back into society. And in fact, he is able to take an acceptance he got to Yale Law School, which he deferred, and he went to Yale Law School and excelled there, including with the understanding of his schizophrenic diagnosis. So he continued to make a big name for himself, and he had a profile written of him in the news, and that led to other huge things happening for him. He got a memoir deal, and also Hollywood came calling, and Ron Howard was was in the process of making a movie about his life, which is about, it's supposed to be about overcoming the odds of a really debilitating illness, but as a person of genius levels, being able to overcome those odds and, succeed in society. From there, Michael's story becomes strained again, as he can't, I feel like, live up to the pressures of the memoir and of this full speed ahead Hollywood production. One might be reminded of Game of Thrones and how the TV show outpaced the author, and maybe how stressful that could be. I mean, there's all sorts of things, I suppose, that could lead to it, and, Rosen was kind of building up, although he was personally largely on the sidelines for this, but that Michael's mental health was, straining again, and meanwhile he was living alone with his partner, his fiancée, Carrie Costello, And one morning, tragically, Michael has another psychotic breakdown where it seems he believed that she was some sort of, imposter, or maybe he was terrified about being committed again because, things were getting worse. And so maybe she also wanted to have him seek help. And anyway, he stabs her to death in a brutal slaying. And from there, his life spirals, and he's was found sort of mentally unfit to stand trial. Nevertheless, he has been living largely in obscurity now in a mental hospital for decades by this point. And his, all of that promise of his genius and, the memoir deal and the movie, were all scrapped. And yeah. It's a tragic story, and I felt like, the strongest parts of it were, I think Rosen as a novelist and maybe his, personal affiliation for these characters could make them come alive and become, really visceral and compelling characters. I think where he started to lose the thread is, how long this book is, and it's because he meanders into armchair politics and armchair cultural commentary and armchair psychology and mental health commentary, which I felt like a lot of that research was relatively unsubstantiated and not the strongest part of the story. Anyway, it was taking us away from the strongest part, which was about Michael, and maybe even complex or interesting questions that I think a lot of other people, readers, might have struggled with Rosen. Like, is it his place to tell this story? And like, is he really being a good friend? And, it's sort of the irony, I suppose, that Michael wasn't able to do it, so Rosen stepped in. But all of that being said, I think I am going to read more Jonathan Rosen books this year. I mean, I'm debating it for an upcoming readathon that, I'd already chosen some books for, but I might go ahead and read some Rosen books instead. So he might still be on my radar. In fourth place, I put The Art Thief, a true story of love, crime, and a dangerous obsession by Michael Finkel. So when it comes to fourth and third prize, which is, that threshold of the book you don't want to advance to the next round and the one you do want to advance to the next round, sometimes some judges say they have difficulty deciding between the two. And I feel like that's kind of the case for me this round as well, that my fourth and third choices are both compelling biographies, and I had to go ahead and ultimately choose between them. And so here's my justification why I put this one a little lower, I guess. So anyway, a quick recap of the book. This is the story of Stefan Breitwieser, who is a native in France, but became infamous in the 1990s up through the early 2000s for being one of the most successful art thieves ever. And unlike many art thieves, his motive was not financial to, sell them on the black market or what have you. He just wanted to personally be surrounded by that artwork. And all of it he kept in his attic apartment that he lived in his mother's house, where she was, I think, living in a bit of denial, and that he didn't bring her in on his schemes. But Breitwieser did bring in his girlfriend, Anne-Katrine, who in a lot of cases was in fact his lookout, as he perfected ways to steal various art pieces. So the book goes into tracking their acts of thievery, and talks a bit about, his personal tastes, and tries to go a bit into, why he did it, his justifications, his possible mental health. And, there are some disagreements about whether he has what is called Stendhal syndrome, which is being overwhelmed by art, or if it's something, I guess, more, common, like just kleptomania, or, something in between. So I thought that, it's a compelling story, and I think some of the things that work against it, though, is much like the last book I talked about, Finkel tends to meander into other topics sometimes, some fascinating topics about art and history and history of art thievery, but sometimes then it took me a while to get back into the main story of following Breitwieser and remembering the facts of his life and his details. At the end, of course, things take a more exciting turn, I suppose, as he is ultimately found out and the authorities slowly realize what a big fish they've reeled in, and Breitwieser, in fact, has to, start to, come to some sort of terms with what he's done and how he's going to present himself. But I do feel like, I guess I did, go down one of the rabbit holes with Finkel about, this artwork was created for rich patrons to be viewed by a couple of people, not necessarily to be viewed by the public. So in that way, Breitwieser, I suppose, brought the artwork back to its true purpose, except like rather than being a rich patron, he was just, the most successful thief. But anyway, yeah, it was a short, slight little book about a character I probably wouldn't have personally known much about, and I'm very grateful for the BookTube Prize for that. But I have to admit that part of the reason I also did put it in fourth place is that in comparison to the next book, I feel like his story isn't as socially important, if I can make that sort of argument. But otherwise, I do think the books have a lot of similarities, and both are compelling reading. But to move into my number 3 book, which I voted to advance to the quarterfinals, and indeed did advance to the quarterfinals, we have Flee North, A Forgotten Hero and the Flight for Freedom in Slavery's Borderland by Scott Shane. So this is ostensibly the story of Thomas Smallwood, who was a black man born into slavery in Maryland, who ultimately was granted his freedom and worked for a while as a free black man in the DC area. And ultimately, he was able to team up with a northern abolitionist called Charles Torrey, and Torrey's knowledge of the North and Smallwood's knowledge of the DC area made them sort of ideal partners in the 1840s to be among the first people who organized the escape of enslaved people to Canada. And it is through these efforts that the Underground Railroad got its name, mostly from the bewilderment of the planters thinking, like, how did their, slaves escape? Like, what, crazy means did they use? And Smallwood kind of ran with the Underground Railroad moniker. So Smallwood is a man who himself ultimately, after a while, the authorities were sort of closing in on him, and he and his family ultimately escaped to Canada. And he lived a relatively quiet life. He did write his own memoirs, but is largely a forgotten historical figure, and I think the point of this story is to bring him back into the limelight. Though that being said, it's not only a story of Smallwood, and it can't or didn't go very specifically into the Underground Railroad. I don't even know how many of, the details of the exact stops or whatever is available, because obviously at the time they wanted to keep it secret for its safety. Although one of the major, intriguing things about Smallwood is how he would mock his planter neighbors in an abolitionist paper that Torrey was a part of. And he would mock their bewilderment about losing their property, and also give some really searing commentary about slavery and racism. And it's all very harrowing, and for my personal bias, it's especially harrowing because all of, or the vast majority of the events of this book took place in what's called the borderlands, because it's kind of between the southern states and the northern states, the slaveholding states and the non-slaveholding states, and that would include primarily Baltimore and DC, where I grew up and currently live. And so, yeah, it's a compelling story, and again, I guess I'm justifying that this is a character who is an important figure historically to know about. Even if he wasn't, the entire focus of this biography, But I can't help but think that like a little bit of the attention on Tori and then also on an antagonistic character kind of fleshed out, the world of the story a bit. The antagonistic character was Hope Slater, who was an infamous slave trader of the time. And Smallwood and Tori were, on one side, and Slater was on the other. I'm not really saying my shapes correctly, but anyway, it really fleshed out the reality of the world they lived in, and yeah, I mean, these men knew each other, and in fact, I think Slater had a part in bringing Tori down because ultimately Tori was arrested for his abolitionist activities and died of illness in prison. I guess to quibble about some things, because I also have to justify putting this as number 3 and not higher, is I do wish that the author had challenged Smallwood a little more, since he is technically the center of the story, and he left behind so many writings himself. And I do think, when it comes to how Smallwood was described, his commentary on U.S. racism and so forth seemed, on point. But, maybe some other things, particularly how he was lauding the British Empire and Canada at the time, maybe not so much. And I just kind of wish that, Shane had offered a little more complexity and challenged the character a little more to make him a little more of a, nuanced character. But I guess ultimately that's a pretty small quibble. And yeah, I'm really grateful that I learned a bit more about this history, which, personally, like it was so sorely lacking, and I feel it especially since, this is the history of the area I live in as well. I think it's a worthy and important book. In second place, I put How to Say Babylon, a memoir by Safia Sinclair. This one also moved on to the quarterfinals, which does not surprise me at all. I might even go ahead and make my annual prediction that this is the book that I've read that I think it might have a very good chance of making it to the finals round in nonfiction. Anyway, this is a very buzzy memoir about Safia Sinclair and her upbringing in the 90s and 2000s in Jamaica, where she lived under a very authoritarian rule of her father, who followed some Rastafarian precepts. So the memoir starts with a little bit of the history of the Rastafarians and how it influenced the culture of a small Jamaican sect. And in fact, the Rastafarians, in a way, are very reviled in Jamaican culture, and Sinclair was a little bit, isolated from her peers. And there's some similarities, I think, with Tara Westover's Educated. She came from a fringe American community in somewhat a similar fashion. So, the memoir goes through Sinclair's life and a little bit into, the upbringing of her parents and how they got together. And she recounts with, sort of visceral detail a lot of the abuses that she suffered under her father, who, had to have an authoritarian, iron grip on the family. Although, to be fair, she also gets into the complexities of her upbringing. Like, she wasn't completely isolated from everyone. Her mother brought poetry into her life, which ultimately led to her career in poetry, and that's what she was previously known for, which I think got her this book deal. And so it goes into, I think, like the major crux of the story ultimately is about Sinclair finding her own voice, and she talks beautifully about sort of having to kill the image of this docile, sort of beaten down feminine model that her father wanted for her. And it just, it's a beautiful, nuanced story to that effect. I mean, to be fair, I also feel like, some of her writing style might be a little too esoteric for me personally, maybe leading too heavily in to the poetry direction when that's not my preferred genre a lot of the times, if I can dare to say that now during National Poetry Month. Some of her more broad cultural commentary, I guess I found, I'm not sure I fully personally agree with, although I understand where she is coming from and why she has come to, the broader beliefs about society that she has. That's just to say I didn't find it a perfect story, and maybe I especially overanalyzed because I put it in second place rather than first place. But there's a lot of buzziness around this book, and I'll just add my name to the hype. I think a lot of people would find it really readable and compelling and a good one to add to their lists. And finally, in first place, I put Judgment at Tokyo, World War II on Trial and the Making of Modern Asia by Gary J. Bass. This book did not advance to the quarterfinals, which frankly I'm not all that surprised about. I think it's a pretty high bar of entry for interest because it's a sprawling historical book about a very detailed trial that took place after World War II in Tokyo. And the author goes into a lot of those granular details. And, it's a book that took me a whole lot of time to get into and get through because it's so long. And I don't know, sometimes I wonder if, you invest so much time in something and maybe that is what makes me have to justify investing that much time. Or maybe it's my personal tastes growing into this area where getting into this granular detail and this, expansive detail really gives a full and complex understanding of what happened. And went into Bass's treatise about whether or not the trial stood up for justice and its blind spots at the time and how it fit into the broader narrative. I mean, because technically the Tokyo trial, like Nuremberg, is supposed to be about, ending warfare and ending conflict and, and having some sort of set of rules about how a just global society moves forward. But, it's still about the victors over the vanquished. And, at the same time as this trial was happening, old alliances were fracturing and, the Cold War was on our doorsteps and regimes continued to devolve into authoritarianism, although Japan ultimately was not one of them and had a pretty miraculous shift from a hyper-militant imperial society into something much more democratic. Not to say that there aren't right-wing nationalists in Japan who can take some of the arguments from this trial to bolster themselves. But yeah, I found it all really fascinating, all of these questions about justice and accounting for war crimes in new ways because, the liberating powers that be were creating sort of new terms and about mass crimes against humanity and holding Japan and other Axis powers accountable to those. And there's questions of the validity of that. It also takes a critical look at Japan and Japan's argument was fighting against Western imperialism, and that was a major reason for its war efforts, but at the same time, a lot of its cruelties were directed against their fellow Asian countries, and they had their own sets of biases and, horrible crimes about mass rapes and murders and killings. Not to say that a lot of the Allied partners didn't do a lot of the same, and more harrowing crimes, like when you think of the atom bomb as well. And so it just goes into all of those questions about what the Tokyo trial attempted to do, what it ultimately did, how it fits into history and reckoning with a lot of the abuses of World War II and beyond. Yeah, it was a trial where the judges were not in a lot of agreement, and there was jockeying for which countries got to sit on the trial, and there was still the British imperialism still looming over the Allies themselves, right as a lot of their colonialist projects were starting to falter. We follow a variety of characters that bring a sort of specific personal bent to the story and people's justifications and motivations for what they did during the war and during the trials. So yeah, I found it all really fascinating. I mean, again, I don't think it's for everyone, and would especially probably would speak to people who already have an interest and grounding in this history of World War II. But I felt like I had to give my personal props to how compelling I find this expansive, challenging history. Even though it's not in the prize any longer, I hope more people will pick it up. And that about covers it for me now. I think I ended up rambling longer than I thought I would, going by what I see in my battery on the view screen. So I'm going to wrap it up here. And I have left links to my Goodreads reviews for all 6 of these books now that I'm finally officially allowed to post them. And I hope to be back on this channel imminently to do a TBR video for my BookTube Prize quarterfinals ballot. I'm very excited about all of that. I'm excited that we're in the throes of the BookTube Prize, and I want to thank Robert and all of my fellow judges for continuing to make this happen. And I'll have more information about the BookTube Prize as well listed down below. So yeah, I hope you're all doing well with your reading, whether you're reading for this prize or not. Thanks so much for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next time.